an honor to be with you. I went to your website and I looked at the list of, well, it's a limited list now that I've seen other names of people that are that also have been here. And to say now I'm going to be part of this company, my goodness, you know, it's quite an honor. And also to be looking into that bas-relief about Sacco and Vanzetti. I grew up in Puebla, Mexico, and my father made me aware of Sacco and Vanzetti and the injustice that had been made to them. And then also the other thing that I grew up with was the Mártires de Chicago. He didn't say Chicago, he said Chicago. Los Mártires de Chicago. And it was my pleasure and honor to give him a photograph of me taken at the burial site of the Mártires de Chicago in Chicago. And so I grew up with a father that was in many ways very absent, but his presence was through these kinds of examples, you know, pointing out the way in which the world had mistreated some wonderful people. And the other thing that remains in my memory and in my heart deeply is we used to have Life, the magazine. It was called Life en Español. And he came one time, and the Life issue was there with Eisenhower bowing in prayer. And he said only one word, hipócrita. And that means hypocrite in English, in case you didn't catch it. It's so close that sometimes I don't translate it. Hipócrita. And I did not know it at the time, but at that particular time, the Eisenhower administration was involved in the assassination of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Africa. And years later, when I saw the Godfather, there is a conversation between Michele, Michael, who eventually becomes the Don. That's why I don't want any Don associated with my name. and his wife-to-be, and he says, well, my father is a businessman, just like any businessman, just like the President of the United States. And she says, oh, Michael, you're so naive. The President is not involved in murdering. And Michael says, who is being naive? And of course, if you remember The Godfather, that said in the 1950s, precisely at the time that the Eisenhower administration was directly involved in the assassination of Jacobo Arbenz and Patrice Lumumba. So I eventually put all of those things together, Sacco and Vanzetti and Los Mártires de Chicago and Hipócrita. You know, those things finally came to me all together and formed the core of who I am. And then around that core, later on, other kinds of things were added as I moved from Mexico, partly because of my participation in demonstrations against the government because of the way they were mistreating the poor over there in Mexico, made my way to the United States, and then came in touch with incredible people like James Lawson, who was an associate of Dr. Martin Luther King. He's a very dear personal friend. He's a United Methodist minister as I am. And of course, totally committed to nonviolence. And so when I mention the word outrage here in the title, I do not mean, you know, find a weapon or find a way of striking someone, but find clever and smart ways to really enter into the fray. But the main point, of course, is to move from dreaming into action more than anything else, and very carefully thought out action, just the way as Lawson was involved in training young people that had the knee-jerk reaction to hit back, and were trained. You can be trained to not kick back, to not hit back, to sit at a lunch counter and allow others to mistreat you and drag you out without, you know, even though you're powerful and strong, you don't react that way, and eventually that triumphs. So when keep that in mind as you hear me talk about moving from dreaming to outrage. Another very dear friend that came into my life was the man who actually recommended to Martin Luther King to bring Jim Lawson into the movement. And he was a white Methodist pastor. His first name was Glenn, and his last name will come to me as I keep on talking. He is in many iconic photographs. He's the white pastor, the white man sitting next to Martin Luther King as they integrated the buses. And Smiley was his last name. Glenn Smiley worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and he was the one who told Martin Luther King, you need to get Jim Lawson. Jim Lawson has been in India for some time now. He has been learning nonviolence, and he really is someone that the movement needs. And the story of Glenn is an amazing story. He had a stroke, and for 15 years he couldn't say a word. And one morning he, quote, woke up and said and gave 113 speeches after that. Fortunately, he came to Hollywood United Methodist Church during that time. That's when I befriended him, spent significant time with him, saw him talking to children on a Martin Luther King Day when my son was in kindergarten, and the teacher said, do you know anybody that worked with Martin Luther King? I said, do I know somebody that worked with Martin Luther King? And brought Smiley, and the teacher said, tell him just 5-10 minutes. The children have very, short attention spans. He was with them for 45 minutes, and the kids they knew they were in front of an avuncular, a grandpa kind of a figure that was telling them very, very important things. And the children just were asking questions, and he related to them in a beautiful, beautiful way. He was already in his 80s at that time, and sat on the floor with them. And so I have been provided by what I call providence with incredible friends that in some way have put me in touch with the likes of Martin Luther King, whom I never met, but who I knew about, of course. And one of my dreams, one of my hopes, is to preach in as many pulpits as I can, where he has also preached. And it was easy to preach at Holman United Methodist Church, where he was invited several times by Lawson, among others, to come over and also his predecessor, and preach to that black church in Los Angeles, one of the most influential churches in the city of Los Angeles, Holman United Methodist Church. And I have preached at Holman United Methodist Church. Mi hermano David was with me when I preached at Riverside Church, another place where Martin Luther King spoke, and what an honor it was to be in that church. I stayed at the pulpit just for a few minutes because I'm not someone who likes to stay in the same place. I like to move around, and so I went to the chancel and I was jumping up and down. I won't do that partly because we're recording this. Unless it's really wide angle, then I can move a little bit more. But anyway, so now I discovered by looking into your website that Martin Luther King spoke here as well, and so this is number 3. And I'm asking Mary Elizabeth Moore and others to see if I can preach at Marsh Chapel, where he also preached, because he studied under the professors there at Boston University, and in particular came under the influence of the great mystic that was the dean of the chapel there for so many years. I did get to hear his beautiful voice. I remember when I heard him, I thought, well, if there's a way in which God speaks to human beings, God must sound a lot like this man. Just this deep, beautiful voice, and slow, the pace, Many times when we hear African Americans talk, they seem to talk too fast. I felt they had really graduated to English when I could understand blacks in the streets. But then when I heard the likes of Martin Luther King and Jim Lawson and I'm blanking now on the dean of the chapel there, was there for so many years, wrote Jesus and the Dispossessed, the pace they have and the beauty with which they speak. And I'll never forget, if I may be allowed later on at time for the grace, I will share the grace that that he shared with us when the one and only time that I met him. So I have been privileged, I say by providence, to be in touch with incredible people, and many of them were associates of Martin Luther King, and so it is an honor to be with you here. If you read the description of what I want to share with you, you know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to ask you to, yes, if you want to remember the I Have a Dream speech, go ahead and remember it, but please do move quickly to the more pointed critiques of the system, especially to the April 4th, 1967 presentation that he gave at Riverside Church, where he denounced those horrible triplets of militarism, racism, and consumerism. And then you will understand why today the conversation, the dialogue, the jousting still goes on between the likes of Cornel West and Coates, you know, those that would like to accommodate, to live with, to survive in some ways, and those who really are calling America to be America. And let's not forget that before there was the I Have a Dream speech, there was Langston Hughes, who also had a dream and talked about that dream, but also in the poem asked us all of us, to make sure that we turn America into the America that it can be again. I will refer to that in a few minutes later on. So the question is not whether or not we remember Martin Luther King today. There are people outside that are remembering Martin Luther King today. We saw as we were walking here a couple of African American people that were begging, essentially, using the opportunity that, you know, this is the date close to the birth of Martin Luther King, and they're going to have an event, and do you have $1? You know, should you just flip the coin, you know, as he reminded us. Do we just flip a coin and think that we have solved the problem? Of course not. Or there are others that are using the opportunity to sell their wares, you know. Oh, Martin Luther King Day, you know, 20% discount of... Here's the man who denounced consumerism and now being used to sell stuff, you know. 20% discount for this and buy the other. I will never forget a Bank of America ad that said, "Free at last." And it had an RV or some kind of a vehicle, you know, right by the ocean, you know. And is that what Martin Luther King meant when he said free at last? For God's sake, the way the system is capable of twisting the message of anyone that critiques the system. And unfortunately, they have ways of making us forget. So the second part of what I want to share with you today is that the taming and even the forgetting of the message is not accidental. I just want to run a little test that I've been running all over wherever I go. I actually asked, the last time I asked this was in the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, where I was part of a tour that was being guided in English. And I said, look, I just want to know, how many of you here know about Alexander von Humboldt? And one hand went up. So I'm asking you, how many of you know about Alexander von Humboldt? Okay, one. All right, see, you are already better than most. And some of them were Latinos, because Latinos, we will never forget Alejandro de Humboldt, because he was in the colonies and left a major imprint. But what was it, 4 hands, 5 hands that went up? You're not uneducated, and this is not an indictment on you at all. I keep on telling people, because, and I speak primarily around very educated people, politically aware, etc., and the reply is almost always the same. It's rare to have even one hand go up about Alexander von Humboldt. So I'm not going to give you my talk on Alexander von Humboldt. Maybe I can be invited back to talk about Alexander von Humboldt, because he was extremely important. But I'd give you at least a tip. Get Andrea Wolf's The Invention of Nature. It's the book that came out about 4 years ago. It's very good. Andrea Wolf lectures all over the place. I saw her at Caltech the last time. And as I said, I will have, if I'm invited back, it's an interesting talk. I can tell you that it would be an interesting talk on Alexander von Humboldt. But the issue is, why was he forgotten? Well, it doesn't happen accidentally. Why is it that Martin Luther King is being domesticated? Why is his message now being tamed? This is not accidental, this is intentional. André Giraud wrote a book called The Violence of Organized Forgetting. If you do not read the book, at least remember the title. The Violence of Organized Forgetting. In other words, the reason you do not know anything about Alexander von Humboldt is because of the violence of organized forgetting. The reason most people only know about I Have a Dream is because of the violence of organized forgetting. People do not want us to remember April 4th, 1967. They want us to keep on dreaming. George Carlin, I commend to you to go to YouTube and read about Education in America by George Carlin. It's unfortunately laced with all kinds of F-bombs, and a lot of people get, oh my God, he's using that horrible word, instead of listening carefully to the message that he's saying. And he says, the reason why the American dream goes on is because you have to be asleep to have the American dream. In other words, it lulls you. It lulls you into dreaming and away from acting, which is what we need to do. And it is not accidental. I will not summarize the book, but I urge you to at least think about the fact that the forgetting of anything that's important, the forgetting about Los Mártires de Chicago was not accidental. It's very deliberate. There's a wonderful book, actually 2 books, they're companions, by James Loewen. The book is called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Right? How many of you know that book? All right, more hands went up than with the von Humboldt book. Well, there's a companion book called Lies Across America. And it's about monuments, right? And about how the monuments send us in a completely different direction of what actually happened. And I will use as a partial example the monument to the policemen, the heroic policemen during the Haymarket riots. Okay, already riots instead of rebellion. The policemen are the heroes, when in fact, it was discovered eventually that the policemen started the riots, that they were the ones who threw the dynamite around, that it was not these anarchists that ended up dead, right? Not all of them, by the way. One of them was a Methodist. I'm a Methodist from England, a Methodist lay preacher who was saved by the fact that thousands upon thousands of letters poured in asking for him to be not executed, because he could not have possibly participated in mass murdering like that. He was a Methodist, and he was spared. He was spared. But again, the lie. What was a rebellion is called a riot, and the perpetrators of the violence are elevated as the heroes. Well, what happened to that? Fortunately, what happened to that monument to the heroic policeman? It has been defaced over and over again, and it has been moved from one place to the other, to the other, to the other. Guess where it sits today? Inside a bank, behind thick glass. So it means that at least some people remember that not everybody can be fooled by the violence of organized forgetting. And I trust that this church is part of that rebellion against that organized forgetting, and that we will stand for not just the injustice to Sacco and Vanzetti, or the injustice to the Mártires de Chicago, but also the injustice that is being done when only the dream speech is being passed around all over today, and nothing is said about the letter, for instance, the letter from Birmingham jail, or the wonderful and pointed critique of the system on April 4, 1967, from Riverside Church. Let us not forget that, among other things, Martin Luther King was a pastor. He was trained theologically. And if you want to bracket God in your life, at least do not bracket it off in the life of Martin Luther King. He was born into the black community, a community that strangely keeps believing in God in spite of the fact that faithful believers went out to Africa and yanked them out of their original places and brought them over here. How in the world could those people still believe in God and be animated by the belief in God and create a Martin Luther King? The greatest proof for me that there is a God is the black community and the gay community, the believers in the gay community that still believe in God. There is a gay theology of liberation, and I go, oh my God. How can it be that people that are persecuted by the believers in God turn around and say, no, in spite of you, I still believe that there's a moral force in the universe, and there's that source is the one that animates me to just keep on telling you that you are wrong and that God loves me, black though I am, gay though I am, whatever it is that I am. That's what animated also Martin Luther King. And he was able to do what he did because he had that strong belief, and that he believed that his life was counting for something, and that he knew that even if he was going to be assassinated, the message would continue. Oh, I think he knew that the stories would come out about his having affairs and all of those kinds of things that tried to devalue the person that he was. But the message remains. And it is an opportunity, our opportunity, to make sure that that is not forgotten, and that we then multiply the power of those words. Well, let me go back now to the original dreamer, and that would be Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream, the dreamer's dream. Let it be that great strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme that any man be crushed by one above. It was never America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who